This is the July 25th, 2011 meeting of the Littleton's Planning Commission. Can we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Elrod?
Here.
Commissioner Bockenstead?
Here.
Commissioner Coronado?
Here.
Commissioner Newthinky?
Here.
Commissioner Samuelson?
Here.
Commissioner Metcalf?
Here.
Commissioner Ranville?
Here.
Commissioner Gallagher? Commissioner Bagnall? You have a quorum.
Thank you. And I'd like to remind everybody that if you have a cell phone, please turn it off because it interferes with the room sound system, and it might cause some reverberations. So, all right, any changes to the agenda? Seeing none, let's move to the approval of minutes of the June 27, 2011 minutes. I have one comment. Dave Metcalf's name.
Again? Actually, that also appears on page 3.
Motion to approve the minutes with that change?
Actually, I had a couple more.
Did you?
If I might. Under 3A, I'd like to add a note that these were approved prior to my arrival. The other stuff is just editing and wording. It's not significant. Sorry, Craig.
Okay. Were there any other comments before I make that motion? I'll state the motion again to approve those minutes.
Second.
With those comments.
Okay, all those in favor?
Who seconded, please?
Jenny Randall. And that is unanimous. So that takes us to general business, which is an ordinance repealing the city's lighting requirements, Title 10, Chapter 15, and reenacting new lighting requirements. It's case number TXT 09-0001. Jen?
Good evening, Commission. In 2003, City Council adopted the city's present lighting requirements, which are included in the city zoning regulations, which is Title 10, and that chapter for the lighting is Chapter 15. And Council has recently directed staff to prepare a new simplified lighting requirement to replace the existing requirements. I included in the staff report, I had 3 attachments, and I'm going to, one is the proposed ordinance, and when I sent the packets out to you, Suzanne hadn't completed reviewing the ordinance, so it was a draft that you received. Well, of course, since I did that, she had to change. So I had to make some changes to the ordinance. It was basically only affecting Section 1015-2, the applicability section. And so I'm going to pass out to you a revised ordinance that she has signed and approved, and then the corresponding version of the lighting ordinance in the codified format if this gets approved. I gave you this in your packet so because it's a little easier to read than the actual ordinance itself, you know, so this is the you got this in your packet, but this one I'm sending out to you is the one that has the revisions in the applicability section, and I'll explain those in a little bit. So I better keep. Since the adoption of the present lighting requirements, staff has found interpretation and enforcement of those requirements to be rather problematic. So, and additionally, in the 8 years since those requirements were written, some of the technology or terminology that was used has become antiquated. So over the past several years, we had continued to experience problems with the, and I listed the current requirements, and these are, I bulleted the issues that we had problems with it. One is lack of flexibility to address diverse conditions present in Littleton, such as the smaller lots and building setbacks in the downtown area, and variations in topography of adjoining lots. The second issue we had was failure to adequately address holiday lighting, lighting on historic buildings, accent lighting, and outdoor recreational lighting. The third bullet is we also had an issue. It was failure to address lighting-related safety issues. Another issue was impractical applicability and enforcement, and the last one was lack of a workable variance procedure. So for those reasons, staff decided to take a look at this code and try to improve it and address some of the issues that we've had and bring it up to date. So I've been working on that actually for quite a while. And on April 12th, staff brought the proposed revision, not the revisions you have necessarily in this packet, but a proposed draft, earlier draft to council on April 12th at a study session. And those revisions addressed these issues I just mentioned. However, council felt that both the current lighting requirements and the draft that I had submitted to them on April 12th, they were concerned about it and felt that it was too complicated and onerous for property owners, residents, and business owners. So after that study session, they had council directed staff to prepare a more simplified regulation that addressed only glare and lighting trespass issues affecting adjacent residential uses, natural wildlife habitat areas. I mean, they specifically said South Platte Park and, areas like that, so I tried to put that in a category. And they also didn't want glare and lighting trespass issues to affect public street rights-of-way for, issues of safety. So I basically took that draft and I cut about 6 pages out of it and modified a little bit to have it make sense in a simpler version. So that's the draft you have in front of you tonight. I'll just briefly kind of go over the different things that we addressed between the current code requirements, that's Chapter 15 in the code right now, and this new draft that you have in front of you. In formatting, we did some revisions there. We reorganized the requirements for simplification and improved readability. The current code kind of has things sort of going all over the place, and it's sort of hard to find certain things in certain places because it really probably belonged somewhere else. So I went through and redid that. We moved the definitions actually from the front of the section to the rear of the chapter to make that more easier to read. And also updated some of those definitions as well. I also removed several because there was a lot of definitions that they were of terms that weren't even being used in the code, so I took a lot of those out. The other thing is our current code has separate sections for outdoor advertising signs, prohibitions, and exemptions, and so I simplified the format by moving those 3 things under one section in applicability instead of having a separate section for signs, a separate section for, it was just, there was like too many sections in that current code. So we modified, simplified the purpose and intent statement a little bit. And then under applicability, and I'll just explain what I changed here on this draft you have in front of you, that needed changing. Our present requirement actually contained an amortization period that required all non-compliant exterior lighting to be brought into compliance with the requirements within 5 years from the effective date of that ordinance. So that ordinance was adopted in 2003, and that meant that all properties had to be in compliance by 2008. Well, there's thousands of properties out there in Littleton, and so it was very impractical to apply these requirements to all the properties by that deadline. So that was a little impractical and very difficult to deal with. So because of that, staff basically only applied the present requirements to all new commercial, industrial, and multifamily residential developments that were going through a site development plan approval process, or were dealing with, sorry.
Just touch it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, anyway, so we applied the current code to, any projects that were going through site development plan approval or were coming in to do exterior renovations that include replacing light fixtures. And for single-family residential property, we don't review their building permits for exterior lighting, and also that's, there's a lot of single-family residential out there, and so we basically dealt on a case-by-case basis with them. We know when somebody complained about a bright light that they had on one side of the house that was affecting their neighbor, and so we had a few of those, and that's how we dealt with enforcing the new code, or the current code. So I modified this code to make the applicability provisions a little more practical, where all new construction, redevelopment for commercial, multifamily, and industrial that go through site development plan approval do need to meet these requirements. Single family, they need to meet the requirements, but we don't really actually review each permit for that. But it's in the code that they do need to meet that requirement. So if we do get a complaint or something, we will take a look at that particular situation and address it per the code. And same with the outdoor advertising signage. When we get new permits or new site development plans that deal with it, we do that. The draft ordinance that you had actually did call out that for anything that's existing at the time the new ordinance gets approved, we would deal with them on a complaint basis. That's how I had it written in the ordinance. And Suzanne had advised me against putting that particular language in the ordinance, and even though we may practically deal with it that way, she had some legal recommendations not to have that in the ordinance that way. So I changed that just at the last sentence and just explained that all existing lighting on existing commercial on these existing uses would be considered non-conforming, and then they'd be subject to the provisions we have in our chapter 10 of the zoning code that deals with non-conforming uses. So that's the only change I made in what you got in your packets and what I just sent out tonight to you. The lighting standards that we had in our previous code had quite a bit of requirements. It included lighting zones. It included what we call lumen budgets, maximum allowances for lighting properties could have based on their use and their zoning. And then it also had quite a few restrictions for outdoor display areas, which includes vehicle sales, and that was problematic apparently for the car dealerships. This area was really what council, I think, was looking at strongly as far as wanting this code simplified. So what you have in front of you eliminates those requirements that we had before, and actually just deals with trespass and glare. And then also the other thing, the submittal requirement review process was a little complicated. I mean, even single-family residential that had to come in compliance with the code had to submit a photometric plan, and I don't know if any of you have had to pay for one of those, but they are pretty costly. And that was even being applied to some small businesses downtown and some other larger businesses, obviously. And so this code simplifies it quite a bit. The only time, a photometric plan would never be required for single family. We now have a light meter that we can use if we need to evaluate if a light is glaring to a trespass level. And as far as photometric plan goes, we would require that on a case-by-case basis for commercial or multifamily residential if we're we're evaluating a site development plan, and we see that, they've got commercial on these three sides, but we've got a public street on the front, or we have, the South Platte Park on this side, or residential on one side, and we need to evaluate the lighting on that side of the building to make sure it's not trespassing into the residential area or a natural area or whatever, or the street itself. So that would be the only time we'd require a photometric plan, and only just a partial one at that. So we're hoping that would kind of take the burden off of some of the folks that have had to deal with this. Our current code also has a variance procedure that actually takes variances to the Board of Appeals, and that's actually, our zoning code has that anyway for any zoning variance, but our lighting code had a special provision in there for variances to the lighting requirements to go to the Board of Adjustment. And the real problem with the way it's written now is that you basically, if you read through that, you never really get a variance approved. Nobody ever really qualifies for one because one of the things you had to do is you couldn't ask for a variance above the light levels that were allowed, and that was probably the single problem most people had. So it was very problematic. So we changed that, and we call it modifications instead of variances, mainly so it doesn't get confused with the variance that goes to a Board of Adjustment for zoning issues. So we call it a modification. Our draft now proposes some criteria that is a little more reasonable in requesting one of those and meeting one of those, and and we're proposing an administrative process through our community development director's review. And this is real good because there's a lot of special cases out there, and our old code is very problematic because it didn't really, you're not supposed to trespass, and you got property downtown, or you got the building is right on the property line, it's right on the property line with the street, and the lots are just yay big, and there's some other uses out there that were just, our current code was just too inflexible. It just didn't work. And so we were trying to build some flexibility in this process by having modification sections so we could look at some of these special uses, because you can't think of everything off the bat, and it was just, so anyway, so that's kind of that's summary of what we're proposing here with a simpler code and a newer code. And I think that's all I have. And so staff is recommending approval. And after tonight's meeting, we plan to planning to forward your recommendation and this revised ordinance to the council in August. So if you have any questions, see if I can answer them.
Okay, Steve?
Yes, actually would be asking Suzanne about this. Would all the existing lighting be non-conforming, or just the ones that are not compliant with this plan?
Well, in all likelihood, because this plan is so much less rigid, it's good. If it conformed with the old, it's probably going to conform with the new. But as a matter of policy, we don't make anyone conform with the new if they were pre-existing. So it's kind of hard to answer your question because they're probably going to be conforming anyway, but to the extent that they weren't, then they would be legal non-conforming, subject to abandonment or new building permit or some kind of expansion.
So even though they are legal, they would still be considered non-conforming?
If for some reason, and we didn't totally take this out to the different scenarios, but I guess if for some reason somebody complied with the old, but they didn't comply with the new, and again, I'm not sure how that could happen because the old was so much more rigid.
Yeah, I can guarantee you that if they comply with the current code we have right now, they more than comply with this one. I just know from having reviewed their plans.
Yeah, that's what I think too. I think there may be some businesses out there that never complied with the new.
Right, that's correct.
And so it may come up in a business context because there may be some business that was legal non-conforming from, I don't know, back in the 80s or something that never came up to code, that maybe they would be legal non-conforming, but I can't imagine a scenario where that's going to happen to a residence. Can you think of one?
Well, I can. I mean, like I said, we've only dealt with the residential in the past because the neighbor complained about their motion sensor going off and it flashing in their backyard or something like that. And we haven't really had very many of them. So, and actually, to tell you the truth, the way the current code is, I mean, you couldn't even put a 75-watt light bulb on your front porch. That was too bright, and that was one of the concerns City Council had at their study session.
But if it did, what would happen is if a complaint came in and it didn't conform with the current lighting code, we would then look back and see, did it conform with the old lighting code?
Right.
And therefore, was it legal non-conforming before we did any enforcement?
Yeah. And then, and if it is a problem, we'd measure it to see if it really is a trespass on that line, and work with that homeowner with basically just probably some shielding, actually, because that's most of the time that's how that can be dealt with.
My front lights are non-conforming. Karina?
I have a follow-up to that question. So in the case of non-conforming, what are the implications of that for either the business owner or the residential owner? What happens once we have identified that they are non-conforming?
They continue to exist until, in the code is general, there's a general provision of the code, and I can't remember what the three things are, but until there's abandonment, which means hasn't been used for, I think, 6 months in our code, might be a year. Expansion, and I think there's one other.
Okay, so with that, in the instance that someone does complain, what action can we take, if any?
If it's legal non-conforming, then it continues until one of those triggers happens. If it, but again, that's just, it's really unlikely because we're taking a code that is kind of a dark sky code and going back to a code that's a lot more simplistic and therefore lenient.
I mean, the code before, the one we have now, actually was just a section in Chapter 4 that just prohibited noxious glare. And that was very, that's all it says. It was very subjective. And then we did the dark sky ordinance in 2003 because the council at that time had directed that. And so this what we have in front of you now is not as rigid as the dark sky ordinance that's in place now. It sort of goes back to the noxious glare thing, but it's got a little more to it so that it can actually be, evaluated and regulated. I hate to use that word, but evaluated better than just somebody saying that this is too bright here. I don't like it. So we've actually got some standards in which we can take a tool and measure it to see if it is actually.
Okay, then just to clarify, this non-conforming is non-conforming to the current lighting standards as being proposed here.
Right.
Jenny?
Yes, I have a question on, is there an effort to address the uplight from fixtures? A lot of effort to address trespassing on property boundaries. By measuring at the property boundary, are we able to address, for example, parking lot lighting that, depending upon the type of fixture that might create more
Our
uplight?
current code doesn't even allow you to do uplighting.
Okay, that's
at
what I
all.
wanted to double check.
It doesn't allow you to do it. This one does, as long as it doesn't meet as long
That's
as you
what
don't
I
have the
was-
trespass problems and stuff, so.
Okay, so the current code right now does not allow uplighting.
Correct.
This code does.
Yes. As long as they meet the trespass allowances.
Okay.
As long as,
Even for parking lots,
yeah.
for any
For
type of
anything.
use.
Yeah, anything. We had a number of requests during using this old code of, architectural accent lighting that was uplighting on the buildings. And we said, no, you can't do that because the only uplighting you were allowed was it couldn't exceed a 45-degree angle. You can have like a sign with a light going that way, and it was restricted as far as the lumens. But to shoot something straight up in the air to wash a building for accenting, that wasn't allowed. That's not allowed under our current code.
But Jan, there's also nothing in the code that limits the amount of night sky lighting? I mean, the lighting that's reflected, down lighting or not, the light that's reflected?
Not in this current, not in
Okay,
what you've got in
that's what I
front of
was
you.
asking.
It doesn't. The old one did, but the old one was a dark sky ordinance, and this one that's in front of you now doesn't limit that.
And it also doesn't address the more subjective criteria or any subjective criteria regarding glare, as opposed to, I mean, we've got the foot candles at the property line or 10 foot beyond,
Right.
but we've got nothing about, for example, a really bright light on a building shining over into a residential area that may not exceed the 1/10 of a foot candle, but it's still, the contrast constitutes glare. We've got nothing.
Well, you're correct about that. It does. We would try to deal with that as best we can with like a shielded fixture. So if we have like a site development plan that comes in for a commercial building and they've got residential where that could impact that, then we'd look at their plans and require them to at least put shielded fixtures on that side of the property to hopefully prevent that type of situation.
But there's nothing in the ordinance written down that would direct them and tell them to do that. That's going to be a staff interpretation.
It will have to be, yeah. I mean, we had a lighting consultant that actually had a pretty complicated method that the model lighting code used to address exactly what you're talking about, David, and it was a bug rating actually, and it's a backward light and glare, and that's how that would deal with that. But it's complicated, and and I was directed to simplify. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's the kind of complication that it tends to be what causes a lot of problems, especially for residences. When you've got the glare, when you've got the glow from a 3-acre parking lot, it may be hard to turn into a metric or a written ordinance for legal purposes, but that probably has the most effect in terms of habitability and usability. So it seems like we would have at least tried to find a way of addressing that. I guess I'm also a little concerned where it talks about the laser source lights. It says they're prohibited when they're projected above a line horizontal with the light source, which would imply that anything that's horizontal or even downward from a high-mounted source, it'd still be allowed, and that can be just as blinding for a driver or anybody else. So I'm just a little concerned about what I think are some gaps in what's going to be the bigger problems that we're going to find out there with people objecting to the lighting going on next to their residences.
Well, the way we dealt with it with this dark sky ordinance was with the photometric plans and the review of the light fixtures that came in to make sure they complied with that current code.
What worries me about that is, without writing it down with something, an objective measure or criteria, we leave that up to staff interpretation, as we do with modifications. There are no criteria. There is no process. It's basically, if staff or DRC decides it's okay, it's okay. If they decide it's a problem, it's a problem. There's not even an appeal process, which there was under the old ordinance. It just seems like in the rush to try and simplify, we're glossing over some of the problems in terms of the lighting that impacts surrounding neighbors, as well as the potential complaints coming from a process that isn't clearly understood and written down.
Well, I think the process would default back to any kind of code enforcement, which would just be, I mean, isn't this where this is going to land? Code enforcement?
Yeah,
I mean, just with any other code enforcement case, they're going to go out, they're going to issue a notice. If the person doesn't want to comply, then it's going to go through the court route rather than the DRC route.
Yeah, my concern is that we're telling them there to comply with the order, not to comply with something written down in the ordinance, because there's nothing written down in the ordinance. It's a subjective interpretation. And then the only process is to wait until they get a citation and have to take it to court.
Well, there's a measurement from the property line.
But it doesn't measure glare. It doesn't measure night sky reflection and the glow that comes from that. It doesn't. I mean, in this case, with the laser source lights, doesn't even tell them that a laser that's high enough to be projecting into a driver's eyes, as long as it's below horizontal according to the new ordinance, it's okay, and it isn't okay.
Well, the glow would have been dealt with lumen budgets like we have on the current code. I've been directed not to put those in here, so.
I think when you see the amount of complaints we get, I would say probably 90% is the light is lighting up my backyard. And I think this ordinance measures that with the lumens at 10 feet past the property line. I think one thing we notice is glare is very subjective, and that's a tough one. That's a tough one to measure and not be somewhat subjective about it. So I don't think it's a bad ordinance that we have here. I think it's going to address what I think is probably 90% of the complaints that we get. And you don't have to be a physicist to apply it. That's the nice thing.
Craig?
IES, the Illumination Engineering Society, and IDA, which is the International Dark Skies Association, have model ordinances. And I imagine that the 2003 ordinance incorporated some of that language at that time. And reading through it, it is a little bit it is onerous, and I can imagine difficult to enforce. But I wonder, in this revised ordinance, does it incorporate any of the IES or IDA model ordinance language, which is sort of nationally accepted and time-tested?
Well, the purpose and intent statement does. Yeah, and the prohibitions that you have down here for laser source lights, searchlights, and flashing lights, those are included in that. And some of the definitions for shielded fixtures came from that. And so I used, some of that is in here, but not all of it, because when I looked at some of it, I knew that wasn't what, the interest was when I was at this council study session. So
I guess I'd heard when Littleton originally adopted the 2003 ordinance that it was very progressive at the time. One of the first cities, I think, to adopt a dark sky ordinance, and this seems to be a little bit regressive in a sense, obviously due to some problems with implementing it. It seems to be going from more of a performance-based requirement to a nuisance complaint-based.
And let me just say that this ordinance was brought to you at the direction of the council. So there was a study session, and this is what council essentially directed staff to do. In fact, I would say that staff, when they went back and looked at it, put some additional things in there so that they could have some objective standards to enforce it. But, it's being sent to you as a referral, as the Planning Commission. So I think that you all need to look at it from that perspective, because I don't know that staff can sit here and tell you one way or the other whether they think it should be dark sky or shouldn't be dark sky, because that's not what they were directed to do. So I think you all need to look at it from the point of view as planning commissioners, and then make your recommendation to the council based on what you think is best for the city, based on your experiences and knowledge. And, it's real hard for Jan to stand here and defend it, because she also was involved in the dark sky ordinance. And so I don't know, to ask her personally how she feels, I don't know, and I don't know that it's all that relevant.
Maybe it would have been helpful if we had had some kind of summary of what council's comments were, what prompted them to say we need to simplify the ordinance. Was it just the fact of having or requiring a complicated lighting analysis plan from even
Dave, I've got it.
You got it?
I can read it if you want.
Yeah, it came after a session with the car dealers, I think.
But we didn't get that in the packet.
Yeah. Well,
That could have saved a lot of time.
Well, this is a city council meeting of April 12, 2011, and from the minutes, it says it was moved by Mayor Clark and seconded by Councilmember Trujillo to replace Chapter 15 lighting requirements with the requirement that lighting fixtures shall be positioned such that they do not shine on residential properties in a manner that causes a nuisance, and that light fixtures will be positioned in such a way that they do not shine onto public roadways in a way that causes a safety issue for the staff, to add a feature that allows DRC to handle shielding issues for PD development. And that was approved by all council members except for Cernanek. So does that, from your recollection, does that cover everything? It's from the minutes.
It does. But again, you all are sitting as planning commissioners, so council directed staff to do that. Council didn't direct that the planning commission should just bless what they asked staff to do. I think the council wants the planning commission to look at it from the perspective as commissioners.
All I was trying to do was get a feel for what it was within the existing ordinance that caused concern in city council. What it was it that they thought ought to be simplified or pulled out that was causing undue problems as a zoning or complaint or enforcement issues. So we'd have some sense of what they were trying to accomplish by this.
It was coming from the businesses indicating that it was very expensive to come up to lighting code, and that, even security in a parking lot for a car dealership, because of the I'm just paraphrasing kind of what I remember of the meeting, but...
we weren't allowing them enough light, so council didn't want to have the maximum light allowances per property. So They wanted that eliminated, the lighting zones eliminated, because that regulates all of that on those properties. They didn't want, the expense and the of photometric plans, the very tool that we use to try to measure that before it's built.
And some of the dealers indicated they were being required by their parent companies to do expansions and things on the lot that the city wasn't allowing per code, and that it could force them to have to relocate or negotiate that. That was another factor that was brought up. But.
Okay, so those are a little different from the first two. The first two, as read from the minutes, essentially wasn't asking for anything that wasn't in the existing ordinance. As far as protecting residences against undue light, protecting roadways against light that's going to cause a problem, that was in the existing ordinance. So that really wasn't, apparently was not council's motivation for wanting to change the ordinance.
Well,
it was more the economic impact of property owners or business owners having to provide all the photometric studies, et cetera, and the fact that with complaints that the current ordinance wouldn't allow businesses to put in the lighting they thought they needed might induce some of them to move. Those are very different from the first two that was reflected in the minutes.
Well, I don't know the motivation of the people that voted. I can just tell you that was the discussion prior to the motion. And then the motion was made, and, obviously it hasn't gone to public hearing in front of council, so they haven't really said what their criteria was and what their thinking was.
So at this point, I'm going to inject my editorial comment about why it's important to include in the minutes motivation and reasoning, not just actions, so that someone down the road having to act as a consequence to those actions has some idea what the background or foundation was for the actions in the first place.
Steve?
And Glenn? You had mentioned that this new ordinance addresses 90% of the complaints. Do you know what the other 10% might be that is around that this ordinance doesn't cover?
I couldn't say, but for the most part, we hear from folks that their sleep is being interrupted by the amount of light. That's generally when we get a complaint from code. That's what it is. I don't know if there's an example of a commercial business concerned about another commercial business.
No, you're right. The complaints have either been among single-family residential neighbors, because they've got a patio light or whatever that's flashing in the back bedroom window. Or we've gotten complaints from a resident that lives across the street from a car dealership, because it's coming through his living room window. We have an area along Broadway that's like that. And then I've had, I think the only other complaint we got was for the Rite Aid drugstore on Broadway, because it was kind of bright, and there was a neighbor that lived by there that I don't think it was impacting her personally at her home, but every time she drove by it, she just thought it was terribly bright, so she called and complained about that, and we got them to bring their lighting in compliance with the current code. And we really haven't had many complaints, actually. I mean, there's just been a few with the residential neighbors, and sometimes you come to find out that really is not the basis of the complaint after all. And then we've just had, I can't think of too many.
And I think that was also part of the discussion at that study session, was that we weren't getting a lot of complaints, even from the people who abutted the car dealers who weren't in compliance,
Right.
yet we weren't getting
Right. It was
complaints.
just basically the one complainer, the one man that complained across from Broadway, but we didn't have any others.
Right. It's usually residential on residential, which is why we removed that one section that made it complaint-driven, because a lot of times it's not about
Light.
the lighting. It's about something else, and the city really can't be involved in that kind of enforcement, where enforcement is essentially being dictated by a third party who may have another motivation.
Any other?
I have a couple of comments and some clarification. So clarification on what is written under the lighting standards. We talk about eliminating, and this is kind of as a follow-up again to all the discussions around this, eliminating lighting zones, maximum allowances. We use the car dealership as an example here. This is under lighting standards. And so if we eliminate this, what is it, are we now saying that areas such as dealerships would have to comply with this new lighting standard? Is that what we're suggesting?
Yeah.
Okay. And would they? So could they? Based on the comment that I also heard that they need more lighting for security reasons, et cetera. So are they going to, by default, end up being non-conforming?
Well, if they comply with the new, obviously, if they comply with the current code, they definitely comply with this. If they choose to comply with this code, then they will, be relieved of some of the restrictions. I mean, because basically, one of the terminations for non-conforming use is changing to a conforming use. So, is that how you're interpreting it? They can take their property, if it is even in compliance with the current code, and change it to meet this code.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me ask it another way just to make sure I'm understanding this. So it's not that areas such as vehicle sales and display areas do not need to conform. They no longer need to conform to what were lighting zones. They now need to conform to what we're calling lighting standards.
Or this lighting trespass standard.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, because currently, right now, they're still held to the same trespass standard as they have the current, this is the same trespass standard proposed here that we have in the current code. The thing that they're they're limited to amount of lighting they can have total, like the measurement of the light output, which is lumens. They're allowed just so many lumens per acre of light, and then they're allowed a certain amount of that within. They can only count 30% of their property as a display area, where they're allowed a little bit brighter light in that display area, but it's a limited amount on their property, and that's been one of their complaints. So it's quite complicated reviewing the lighting plan for a car dealership under our current code right now, because they're allowed a certain percentage in this area. They can have this much trespass over here, but they're allowed a cap of lighting total, which is what their complaint has been. So this won't measure that, but it will measure the same trespass allowance that they've had before. So, in my opinion, they're probably going to still have to shield their lighting. And they've never complained about having to put shielded fixtures up. Never. In fact, most of the new parking lot lighting you get today is that way. But what their complaints have been is, I believe, is the amount they're allowed to have, period. That they feel like some of their areas are too dark. And they've complained about that because of a sales situation in the evening, because people really can't see the car that well. And then they have some of their areas behind their building where they've got some of their inventory stored, and that's too dark for security. They've been very concerned about that, and so that's what we were hearing about. So,
Greg?
A couple of questions. The old code specifically exempted the Sternberg lights, and I'm noticing that the new one says roadway lighting. Would that encompass what we know as the pedestrian lighting? Or?
yeah, well, it would be lighting that's in the public street right away, so that would encompass pedestrian and street lighting.
Okay, all right. And then I wonder just if you could briefly explain the difference between an exemption and a modification. There seem to be some elements there that are exempted versus modified that almost seem like they could be in the other categories. For instance, outdoor recreational facilities. I've seen that under exemptions and other codes.
Well, I think our current code has it exempted.
It's under modifications, which I think is on a case-by-case. Oh, the current
Well, I
one.
think our current one had it as
right.
exempted, didn't it?
In the model code, it has it as an exemption.
Yeah, let me double check. I think I have it memorized by now.
But modifications give staff the tools to evaluate the impacts on a case-by-case basis more than the exemptions.
Yeah, I mean, exemption just exempts it, from the regulations, where the modification doesn't exempt it from meeting the regulation. It just gives us we can look at it in a more case-by-case basis and evaluate it to try to work with them to meet the intent of the code in a more flexible means.
Doesn't that amount to a case-by-case exemption?
No.
Rather than a categorical one?
Oh, it me. Well, it might in some cases, I guess. We haven't, without having tested it yet completely, but,
It's funny, when we started talking about lighting as part of the comprehensive plan update, one of the first things that lit a couple of members of the commission off was the idea of the city's roadway, sidewalk, public lighting being exempt from any controls that we would then turn around and impose on property owners. And all we're doing now is endorsing that same thing. Roadway, street, sidewalk lighting, exempt. Property owners, private property owners have to comply, the city doesn't. I'm glad that my house is not next to a designated historic structure or landmark, because they're exempt too. If they want to light the heck out of the building right next door to my private residence, they can do that. I'm not sure how that's essential to the historical character unless they had spotlights in the 1920s, but
Can you come closer to the mic?
Are historical buildings exempt now under the existing code?
Don't that light on the melting pot?
No, are they exempt now? Historical buildings. They're not exempt now?
I don't know, and what caused us to put this in here, this isn't just any lighting on a historic building, it's lighting that contributes to the historic building structure. If there's an historical type of light fixture, and there's a light on the stern, or on the melting pot that actually kind of triggered us to look into having that kind of exemption, because they have a light fixture. I think it's on the front that technically didn't meet our current code. And, you know, so when they came in to do improvements to the building, you know, we worked with them on, they had to bring all their other lighting into compliance, and they had a lot of lighting out there that was not historic. You know, it was, I don't know if you recall, there's some pretty horrible wall packs and stuff on there that were pretty glaring, and they had to shield those or take them down. But they did have a stylistic fixture on the front that was historically significant to that character of the building, which didn't comply with our code as far as being shielded. So, you know, that's what we were trying to address. It's not ruining the historic. It wasn't to allow them to put glaring light fixtures on, but it was allowing them to keep a particular light fixture style that's on their building in that character. So,
Jan, the subject of curfews, that under modifications, I mean, that's essentially, I suspect, addressing the complaints about residences being or objecting to the light coming from an adjacent property impairs their ability to enjoy the outside, the patio, whatever. So the idea of a curfew would be, okay, if the lighting on the adjacent property is too bright or whatever, and we have to let it go because it's zero lot line or whatever, at least we can mitigate the harm by telling them they have to turn off the lights or dim the lights
right.
after a certain time.
Yes,
okay.
that's the intent of that.
Karina?
I have some additional comments on the modifications. Although I appreciate and support simplifying the approval process, and that could be very arduous given the current procedures, I do feel that this is allowing too much control to city staff on making modifications. Specifically, when we look at what are some of the examples that you've outlined here, including parking structures, outdoor recreational facilities, and as I experience these areas now, those are actually some areas that have a lot of light pollution. So I would propose that although I think it is prudent to simplify the process, I do think we have to put out some parameters around what would be an administrative what we would approve as an administrative change versus things that would maybe fall under the current process. Whether that's size or potential impact, I'm not sure what that would be, but I think this goes too broad the other direction.
So you're proposing that they not be reviewed and approved administratively, but taken to another
Not
board?
in all cases. I think we have to set some guidelines or standards of what can be approved administratively versus what needs to come back for approval or another process.
And what board did you recommend that reviews those? That's not administrative.
I think what she's looking for is just a little bit more firmer standards of
Right.
how much and where we can modify them. And we don't have those for you tonight, so.
Thank you.
One of the thoughts that occurred to me was the Board of Appeals normally is going to hear requests for variances that exceed a certain threshold that staff can make decisions on. And I don't know why we couldn't apply the same thing to the lighting ordinance. At least there would then be a process to say if it's such a minor change or exemption or variation from the lighting standard, staff can make that decision as they do with any other zoning rules or questions that come up from a property owner. But if it exceeds that threshold, it needs to go to Board of Appeals as with any other variance.
Well, can I suggest something? I know, because you've got some good ideas, and you're telling them to me, you know, and you know, I think it would be best if you formulated them in a recommendation to City Council, and then, you know, because I don't feel like I should go back and redo this and then take it to City Council. So, I mean, that's just my thought, that if you could make a formal recommendation to City Council, these are your concerns and these are the things you'd like to see. You'd like to see more parameters on the modifications or some of these specific uses on the modifications and all, and then I can, you know, get it in front of them and they can either then maybe direct it back to me to redo this. You know, that's kind of, is that?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, the best way to do that.
The one thing I'd say about the Board of Adjustment is one of their standard criteria is it can't be a self-created hardship. And certainly when you're talking about a new development who wants certain light or they're in a certain situation, it's hard to meet that criteria. So we tried to steer it out of that realm. But believe me, from a staff standpoint, if we had a little bit more defined area to work within, I have no problem with that.
Glenn, does that suggest design guidelines beyond the ordinance, or perhaps a master plan as was proposed in the the downtown area?
I think for this, if you make that recommendation and it goes to council and they go, yeah, well, that's a good thing to do, and, they direct me back, just work on this again. I think I could take a better look at this and come up with some better criteria that might address some of what and look at I've got a boatload of other people's codes in my file, it's just a matter of some time to sit down and hash that through a little better. So that's my thought, is just having it in here, but,
Jenny?
And I do have some language that I think is fairly simple, and I don't know if that's the direction that we're going, is that we're going to look at making some recommendations as far as some possible changes to this. I just wanted to know better as far as how we want to do this logistically.
Should we get, we still have public to talk, so can we get our questions answered and then go back to those? Okay, any additional questions? I'm just looking at my list of questions. Jan, you said on the April 12, 2011 City Council meeting that South Park has their own covenants with lighting requirements.
yeah.
How is that going to relate?
No, they
No,
don't.
I'm okay, maybe not South Park residential. That is, but the South Park
industrial
commercial, they have their design, they have their own set of covenants, restrictions, and design standards that they enforce with their Architectural Development Control Committee. And they have some lighting requirements in that, and most of that's shielded fixtures. So back in 2003, when the other planner, Kevin Reed, was working on this, and he was doing some examples around town of, what was really bad and what really was close to this ordinance, they were a very good example. And you could just tell by taking photographs at night that they were a very good example of being close to meeting a dark sky ordinance. And is that what you're
Well, I'm
referring
just
to?
curious as to how this will all fit into the city's actual requirements. How their requirements will fit into the city's requirements.
Oh, well, frankly, when we get at a property down there to review for a site development plan, we will look at, I can almost guarantee you they will meet these requirements probably, because under the current requirements we have, when we get site plans in with their lighting plans from there in the South Park area, they no question meet our requirements, because they do require quite a bit of shielding down there. So I don't anticipate a problem with that at all, or any kind of conflict, really.
Okay, any other questions? This is a public meeting, so if anybody in the audience would like to address the Planning Commission, come on down. And please state your name and, thank you. Name and address for the record.
Good evening, Commissioners, and good evening, staff. My name is Pam Chadbourne. I live at 5402 South Nevada Street. That's at the northern tip of the football in downtown Littleton. And I think I'm observing that the current Planning Commission has no members from District 1. I am in District 1. The plan that's being developed affects me and my neighbors. My background with this issue is a little less than a year ago, the dentist across the street from me wanted to add a 10 by 10 foot room. As part of the process for the city to review that, he was required to add 4-foot sidewalks, streetlights, 3 where he has none, and bury power lines. So that's how I found out about this issue. I was going to have 3 streetlights across the street from me. And in fact, now construction is beginning. Excel is installing power lines for the installation of those lights. I think that that's not right for Littleton. So I got engaged with this, and I ended up giving 2 or 3 10-minute presentations to the City Council about street lighting. I learned a lot more about street lighting than I ever thought I would. This policy, or this ordinance, I think, should not be approved tonight. It does need more work. What I advocated to the council is that Littleton spend about $10,000 to hire a lighting consultant. Littleton has no lighting expert on staff. They never have. We've never spent money on it. We've had lights for decades. We will have lights for decades. It's a reasonable expense to try to understand this. They will be able to give us good language. The council can indicate that they'd like a simple policy, something that is reasonable to enforce. And perhaps as part of public comment, we all can bring up our issues and get that incorporated as well in that kind of process. But that's what I'd advocate for revision of the lighting code. It's really beyond the scope of staff. It is a technical issue, and I have to say that those technical details can make great lighting, and they can help make a great city. So let's use those to our advantage, not regard them as a problem. They are not. So I wanted to say something about background for the lighting ordinance change. The Mercedes-Benz dealer, who's on Broadway very close to County Line Road, complained to Mayor Clark that he was having trouble selling cars because his lot was too dim. Subsequent to that, the City Council had 3 meetings with car dealers. There's 9 or 11 in Littleton, I guess, and directed staff to redo the policy. Concurrently, I was presenting about streetlights, and a frustrating and discouraging thing to me is that this spits on, I'm sorry, I am frustrated and discouraged. It spits on the presentations that I made. And I'm a resident. I live in Littleton. I want to have a bedroom that doesn't have light shining in, and I'd like not to have excessive noise. I don't think I'm unusual. I think this is typical. And the Planning Commission, you folks are the people who represent us. You represent us who are here now and the future residents and businesses who are not here to speak now. But I think we can kind of tell what most of us want. So I'm hoping, and I'm encouraged by the discussion tonight, that you folks will help the city get to a better ordinance than what this loosened proposal is. And I myself wanted to know the process because I'm not going to give up on this. So if anybody can help me understand where this goes from here, and then how we can get the street lighting language changed and improved, that's what I need to know.
In terms of process, Jan mentioned earlier that this will be going back, they'll take our comments, and then this will be going back to the City Council in August, right? So that would be the process.
The Planning Commission is an advisory group in their capacity today, so they're not passing and they're not the final decision maker. They'll make a recommendation to the council. I'm not sure, when are you scheduled for first reading? First reading will be August 2nd. That'll put the public hearing before council on the 16th.
Anything else for Pam?
And I think that the Planning Commission does not have email addresses available, which is good because I think you all are volunteers and I appreciate your work. But I do have a couple of packages. They talk about the street lights specifically. 330 are proposed, 330 additional street lights are proposed north of Main in this football area. We don't need that many, a third or a half, and these are charged by the installation, by Excel, $11 a month. So installation, operation, and maintenance will be cheaper just by reducing these lights alone. We don't need that many for functionality. We ought to be thinking about energy efficiency, and the city councils of the future have to pay for these. Last year, lighting cost $1 million and overran by $100,000. This is an area that the city needs to work on. Again, the $10,000 for this study is more than reasonable, and I think current situations suggest strongly that we should do that. So thanks for your time.
Thank you.
I have a question. The comment that you made about the dentist's office and that it was going to require additional lighting, is that under, so would that, under the current ordinance as it stands today, would you still be subject to those implications? So that they would in fact be complying with the existing ordinance, which is even more stringent than what is being proposed?
No, it had to do with the fact that it was on public right-of-way.
Okay.
So again, it was exempt from the lighting code. So
see.
as you read in the new lighting code with historic buildings and city structures being exempt, it was all city structures or right-of-way was also exempt in the prior code.
And that was my introduction, was to look at the current code and note that the street lights were exempted. So that right away was an indication that there should be change, but not this change.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Former Chair Norm? No. Any other-body that wants to make any comments? Seeing none, should we close the public meeting? Okay, all those in favor of closing the public hearing? And that is unanimous. Okay, do we have a motion?
I will move that a favorable recommendation be forwarded by the City Council concerning the proposed ordinance repealing Chapter 15, Title 10, and reenacting a new Chapter 15, Title 10 pertaining to lighting requirements.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Craig. And discussion? Jenny?
You know, in general, I've read the what city staff has put together, and I can understand some of the technicalities of it, and that it is, you know, for someone who's reading it, it is fairly technical. For someone who's working on a large commercial project who has like electrical engineers on board, that they would be able to interpret this well. So I can understand why wanting to simplify it, that need. I do, however, think that I did look at the dark skies ordinance prior to this meeting, and I think that there's some language in that is simple, that as is, I think that there's some work on this current, what the staff has put together, and especially in addressing parking lot lighting, in as far as not, that the light is not emitted above 90 degrees, and so that you're not uplighting. And so that to me is very important, in that we aren't uplighting, because it really is excessive from an energy standpoint, and just, I don't think people like the light pollution either. And parking lot lighting especially is one of those areas that I believe we want to downlight, not uplight. And so I do feel very, very firm about that particular issue.
So do you want to make a specific motion to add some things into
I would like to motion that be addressed and updated in the current, what the city has currently put together in addressing non-residential lighting for parking lots that shall have no light emitted above 90 degrees. And an exception could be ornamental parking lot lighting shall be permitted by special permit only, possibly. Architectural accent lighting by special permit. So that might be 2 exceptions, possibly, but I definitely feel that we want, the parking lot lighting is very important. So basically, the motion is non-residential lighting. All parking lot lighting shall have no light emitted above 90 degrees. That's the main motion, in addition to what has been put on the table for the motion.
I'll second that.
Did you want to add the ornamental lighting and by special permit and architectural lighting by special permit?
I think that would be acceptable to add that, to acknowledge that there are different types of lighting in a parking lot other than the traditional overall ambient lighting.
Steve, do you agree to that? Okay, so it's been moved by Jenny and seconded by Steve to add that component to the recommendation to City Council. Any discussion on that?
I have a question. Does that apply to parking structures and illuminated areas that are located more than 20 feet above the street? Those are kind of all clustered together here under the modifications.
I would say no. That those would be special conditions. I think that this would be surface lots.
Okay, any other?
I do.
Karina?
Would we want to limit that only to parking structures? And couldn't that scenario also exist in other areas? So my motion would be that it is not limited to parking structures, but any structure that might have the use of that type of lighting. So I don't know that we should be specifying that it's limited to parking structures only.
The current motion isn't structures, it's
Surface
flat lot.
lots.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Any other discussion? So are we ready to vote? Just on Jenny's motion.
Yes.
Okay, we ready to vote? All those in favor?
Can we restate it? It was modified with the friendly amendment.
I can attempt it.
Somebody's going to have to.
We want to address non-residential lighting for surface parking lots. I added the surface. So lighting that is no greater than 90 degrees. Ornamental lighting will be done by special permit, and architectural lighting will also be done by special permit. Is that right? Okay.
Before we vote, if I may just ask one more question.
Oh, sorry, Jen?
We just want a clarification from staff.
Lots or structures?
Ornamental lighting and the decorative lighting by special permit, is that on the buildings?
If it's above 90 degrees, I believe, is what you're
Is
saying,
that,
correct?
that has nothing to do with the parking lot. That's
And when I say 90 degrees, that's the light itself, the light component. So when it's 90 degrees, it's that perpendicular, so that when you go above 90, basically you've got it's fully shielded. So the light is.
Okay, so what your amendment is that
That the light
it's
fixture
fully
itself.
shielded, okay, except if in a parking lot they want to do ornamental lighting.
Right, if there's some type of ornamental lighting or architectural accent lighting by special permit only
And this is for parking lots.
for parking lots, surface parking lots.
Okay.
And that was sort of my follow-up question, is I can imagine I know parking lots are probably the biggest issue with uplighting, but I can imagine other areas like RTD platforms or plazas at the entries of buildings where that may be an equal concern. And I wonder if that should be broadened to include general site lighting on private properties. Or is that too broad?
I'd support that. I agree that it should be more broader. I don't know that we would want to just, again, limit just that in particular to parking lots.
I'll suggest a friendly amendment that include site lighting in general,
So for
not attached to the building.
non-residential lighting for surface parking and?
Site lighting.
And site lighting? Jenny and Steve, do you agree?
I would support that.
Okay, so are we ready to vote?
Can I ask for another? I'm sorry for the clarification. So you're talking about ornamental and architectural uplighting for surface parking and site lighting by special permit only? Is that what you're suggesting?
If there are some special,
That's what I'm just going to ask you. What do you mean by special permit?
that there would be special authorization, that they just couldn't, that a submittal couldn't just locate those particular fixtures if they're site lighting.
So change permit to authorization? Pardon?
I like the authorization probably better. I don't know if the city has any sort of a
Permit process for that.
process that,
So would it be authorization by staff?
Currently, we have a temporary exemption process. That's not in the revised ordinance.
I mean, any new lighting system requires a building permit. And I guess that's how we would authorize it, through issuance of a building permit.
So permit's the correct terminology?
I think so.
So are we suggesting that if somebody brings in a plan for a new building, all other lighting is part of the plan review and approval, but any site or building mounted or building directed ornamental lighting would have to have a separate special permit? Seems to fly in the face of what we've been trying to do for 3 years with comp plan, simplifying the administrative process. Just me.
Well, I think, yes, we would, it would definitely be a part of the plan review. All the lighting would be, and we would approve it. I think what staff would have to give some kind of blessing would be anything that moves above the 90 degrees as an accent light. Correct? I think that's what I'm interpreting as being said. So if everything meets the standards of the 90 degree, and it also meets the standards of the lumens off the site, it's just a sign-off. If there's a special accent light on the building that's pointing above the 90 degrees, that's when it needs some kind of special approval.
Is there going to be a time limit on this? I'm just trying to think of practical considerations down the road that staff's going to have to deal with, that we're going to have to deal with. If it's not part of the overall plan approval, if it's going to take some special exemption, special permit, special authorization, is this a time-limited thing, or does it go with the building? And if it goes with the building, why not just incorporate it in with the building plan review process to begin with? I'm just trying to simplify the process.
So would that fall under the, I mean, what was articulated here, that it would be a modification? So that could fall under a modification. So they're asking for a modification to what is a standard, and if we're implying here, recommending that the standard should include limitations on uplighting, that particular situation would be a modification, and then we'll discuss what modification means.
As with any other plan variations that came through with an application.
So we have 3 words on the table: permit, authorization, and modification.
I mean, I don't think you need to get into the particulars of it. If you're making your recommendation that you want some kind of authorization, then council can direct staff as to which body they think is appropriate to do that, be it administrative, Board of Adjustments, planning, you know, whatever that is. I think it's more important that you just make your philosophical recommendation to the council and then let staff work out with the council the details of that.
Okay. So any other comments before we vote on the motion as is? Seeing no other comments, all those in favor of Jenny's motion And that is everyone, again, except for Dave. All right, any other discussion?
I'd like to make a proposal on the modifications section. So here, I would propose that we establish a variance, an acceptable variance that can be addressed by administrative staff. In the case where the variance is exceeded, it continues through the current process in place, which is a public hearing process through the Board of Adjustments. I'm not qualified to say what the variance should be, whether you want to call it 10% or something. I would ask for staff's recommendation on that.
Okay, do we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, Dave seconds. All right, discussion? Karina, when I first heard you say it, you said to set guidelines, what can be approved administratively, and that seems a little bit different than establishing a variance that can be addressed administratively.
So what I'm trying to articulate is perhaps something that is temporary in nature or small impact. Again, I don't know how to put a number or define small, and I do understand that's arbitrary. Something that I would say that's either temporary or simple or limited impact would be subject to or allowed to be an administrative approval process.
I'm not sure I'm comfortable with the word temporary. I mean, we're talking zoning and somebody looking for a variance. Usually the assumption is it's permanent.
Temporary, I'm using the terminology that might fall under what they call temporary lighting associated with construction or repair, or temporary that might happen under a special event. That was the assumption or the definition I was putting under temporary timing wise.
And that was addressed under the existing ordinance that has a whole section on temporary permits and that sort of thing. But what we're talking about here with the modifications, or as far as I'm concerned, it's a variance, is the same as if staff were presented with a request by a property owner to allow his roof overhang to extend 1 foot more than code strictly allows, or have his fence be 1 foot higher in this particular portion than is strictly allowed. There's a certain threshold that staff has the discretion to make those decisions. Anything beyond that, a more serious, a more extensive variation from code, from zoning, from the ordinance, has to go to the Board of Adjustment in a public hearing process. And I think that's what we're really trying to get to, is just allow staff some latitude in taking care of those minor variations, but anything that's significant ought to go to Board of Adjustment to the public hearing process. Mm-hmm. And I think really that's what we've been talking about.
So then how do we define significant, or do we need to define significant?
You know, I don't believe I'm saying this, but I'll say it anyway. I think we have to leave that up to staff, as we did with the rest of the zoning process, in determining or defining what the threshold is and how far a particular proposal can go before it has to be considered as significantly varying from the standards that we've established through the ordinance, and therefore requires a public hearing process and consideration by Board of Adjustment. I assume that's how that came about in the first place, isn't it, Jan, for the regular zoning issues? Staff recommendations?
For zoning variances, the administrative variance has a measurement on it. It's 20%. 20% of the setback, 20% of the open space, 20% of the, lot size or whatever. I don't know how you put 20% on this stuff, so I'm not sure where to figure that threshold. I don't.
Karina, I don't know where you're coming down on this, but my concern is more that there be latitude, but that anything significant go to the open public process, public hearing process. there has to be a level of trust here someplace, so you have to leave it up to staff to sit there and say, we think this will work from an administrative standpoint, we can handle this, and let them define those terms.
I agree, that's my intent, yes.
Okay.
For the purpose of the recommendation of council, I think that's good. And if they agree, then they'll send us back and we'll define that criteria and bring it back to you.
So the motion that I have is establish a variance that can be addressed administratively, which would include appeals to the Board of Adjustment. Is that, or do we want to just say the intent?
I think it's going to come across as intent either way. I think the exact wording of it isn't going to matter that much.
Not sure that it included, or appeals is beyond the intent. I think the intent was to have a certain threshold where above a certain size project, it would kick into the Board of Adjustment realm, as well as with appeals.
I think we're just basically trying to get this under the same, within the same boundaries as other zoning variances with a public hearing process after a certain administrative threshold is met.
So let me try to suggest different wording here. The proposal would be to allow an administrative approval process with the exception of in the case of significant variances that it would be subject to public hearing process. So the allowing of an administrative approval process except for in the case of significant variances to the standards that thereby would go through public hearing process and Board of Adjustments.
That's the gist of what I seconded, yes.
All right, so Dave, you agree to those changes?
I feel no heartburn at that.
Okay. Trying to write as quick as I can. So the now motion is to allow administrative approval process with the exception of significant variances to the standards. It will be subject to a public hearing process and/or Board of Adjustments. Is that?
I think the public hearing process is the Board of Adjustment. Yes. I think it's the intent.
So do we include Board of Adjustments or do we not?
It says written here, public hearing process through the Board of Adjustment.
All right, so any discussion? Seeing none, should we vote? All those in favor? And that is everybody for? And any other discussion or motions?
Yeah, I have a three-parter. I'd like to recommend that council have staff reconsider the appeals rights and process per 10-15-12 in the existing ordinance, temporary exemptions per 10-15-10 in the existing ordinance, and the provisions regarding discontinued use and restoration of use under 10-15-2 and 10-15-3 of the existing ordinance. Sorry, Jan, I know that's putting a lot more text back in what you were trying to cut down, and you may be able to cut down the text, but I think those elements are fairly significant. And Craig, that's getting back to what you were talking about what we just didn't address appeals and that sort of thing.
So.
Could you repeat the sections?
Yeah.
Okay. It's the appeals process per 10-15-12, temporary exemptions per 10-15-10, and provisions regarding discontinued use and restoration of use, and that's really in the definitions of in 10-15-2, and then the subsequent section on, I don't remember what the title of it is, on 10-15-3. It's mainly the elements themselves. I just happened to dig up the references so it could direct you to the right place.
Can we take these one at a time? And you're looking 10-15-12 is the first one, right?
That's the appeals process.
And which page is that on?
It isn't in there, sorry, in the existing ordinance.
Okay.
Basically, as with what we just went through, the exact verbiage of what we're saying isn't as important as saying, do we think that the lighting ordinance, as with other zoning ordinances, should include a defined set of appeal rights and process, a process for temporary exemptions so we don't have to get locked into something longer term, which came up with the lighting question that we were talking about with parking. And then there is the question of discontinued use. I know there's a simplified version in there now, Jan. I found it a little confusing as to 24 hours after you stop using it, you can't ever do it again. And I'm not sure that really covered everything as thoroughly as what was in the existing ordinance.
Okay. Do we have a second on the 10, 15, 12?
Yeah, do them all individually.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll second that.
Okay, seconded by Kurt. Any discussion? I kind of feel we've addressed this with Karina's motion to address the appeals process.
That isn't an appeals process. We address the variance process.
Okay.
What does this add, David? This adds, what does this
For
add?
all those things where there are no definitive, objective metrics or standards that might get somebody cited, it gives them an appeals process. So you can do it one of two ways. You either set an objective set of standards that can be measured from an independent or an objective source, or you have to have an appeals process. It'd be nice to have both, but in this case, it's a complicated situation. At the very least, having an appeals process to present it to somebody other than whoever's handing out the citation and have it considered.
So this is essentially if they disagree with what is considered a significant variance.
Interpretation, yeah. It's in the existing ordinance, and that's why I brought it up. At some point, we thought that it was important to have those avenues for a citizen to get a hearing rather than just a citation handed out by staff. I thought it, therefore, would be important to get it back into the process.
Any other discussion? Any comments from staff? All right, should we vote? All those in favor of putting 10, 15, 12 back into the ordinance? All those, Craig?
Sorry, thought I did.
Oh, wait, sorry, I was wrong. So all those, everybody in favor except for Linda? Okay, 10, 15, 10. Temporary exemptions to put this back into the ordinance. Do we have a second?
David, specifically? Well, I'll second that, and then we'll discuss.
And discussion? Seconded by Kurt.
Specifically, what parts of that temporary exemptions were you thinking?
Again, I'm not so much concerned about the details of the ordinance or that section of the ordinance as it exists. I'm concerned about getting that element, that process, those rights back in there. In the case of temporary exemption, I'd like to have an alternative for somebody, for staff or planning commission to approve a permanent situation where a temporary exemption would be perfectly adequate. Actually, how would we propose to handle things like holiday lighting and temporary, street festival lighting or a carnival? I mean, we have a carnival down on the property opposite EchoStar.
In 1015.5 under special event lighting, number 5.
Okay, then maybe we can simplify this thing and I can withdraw my motion. Have we been issuing temporary exemptions under the existing ordinance? And if so, then under what conditions?
We haven't had any.
And I'm perfectly willing to withdraw that particular motion. If we haven't used it up to now, we have other vehicles for dealing with the same situations.
I think that your question
Do you
about
agree?
holiday lighting, it's covered under exemptions too.
Yes.
Do you agree?
fine.
All right, so now we'll take 10-15-2. In the existing code.
Yeah, right now,
So that's the entire definitions?
no, not the entire. It's just where it's, the last item in the definitions in 10-15-2 is use, abandonment of. Talks about relinquishment of a property, cessation of activity for a period of 6 months, da-da-da-da-da. Then it goes down to the next section, 10-15-3. It talks about applicability and the conditions for resumption of use after abandonment. All that gets boiled down into 2 lines in the proposed revision. Under 10-15-3C3, signage for discontinued uses. Sign illumination shall be permanently extinguished within 24 hours if the business is no longer in operation. Seems a little lacking in detail.
So you're proposing,
Are you just proposing taking 3 out?
Well, no, I'm proposing that if we're going to address discontinued use or abandonment or restoration, we have a complete set of terms in there so that somebody, a property owner, who shuts off his light because he has a temporary business setback on Friday afternoon, gets his financing and staffing back in order 3 days later and finds that, oh, gee, it's been off for 24 hours, you no longer have the right to run that lighting. Seems a little lacking in foresight on our part.
Well, I think if you take out number 3, it'll just revert back to the general provision of the code about legal nonconforming,
So the whole question of discontinued use or abandonment goes away, and
because it'll be answered by the general provision, 6 months is abandonment or
there is a general provision for that?
of legal nonconforming. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
There's a general-
Not within the ordinance, just
No,
overall.
just
Okay.
within zoning code.
Okay. In that case, yeah, that's fine.
So you would just be moving to eliminate number 3.
Yes.
I'll second that.
okay, it's been moved and seconded by Kurt. And so any discussion?
So which one are you wanting to just eliminate?
It's on page 3.
New or old?
Yeah, it's on page 3, number 3, under the new proposed revision, 10-15-4, item C, number 3. Just above the middle of the page, Steve. On page 3.
1015-3.
10,
Oh, did I say 4?
10,
Sorry, it's just above 10-15-4.
So it's line 27.
Right.
Line 27 on this one.
Sorry, I was looking at the reader-friendly version, not the one with the lines
Sorry.
numbered.
So we're just to make sure I understand as well. So David, you're suggesting we eliminate item number 3 under section 1015-3C.
C3, right.
And we're eliminating that and replacing it with?
No, just eliminating.
it.
Suzanne's point is, without that in there, then the whole question goes away. It isn't an issue. As long as the lighting is still in conformance, there's no question of a property owner turning his lights off while he goes away for a vacation for 7 days and comes back and finds he has to go through a new administrative process to turn his lights on.
Has this been a problem in the past? Whereas a business goes out of business and,
I think I'd be a little concerned with the 24 hours. Somebody could shut their business off and then can't turn the lights back on. And what Suzanne is recommending is we have a standard for when a non-conforming use loses that right, and that's a 6-month period. So I think she's right. I think we take this out, it defaults back to the standard non-conforming use requirements.
But it has been an issue before where a business abandons and then leaves its signage. We're really talking about signage. So you have a business that goes out and they still leave their sign lit. So not their lights on, but the signage would be lit up forever, and
Forever is 6 months though, right?
6 months, and then some letters go out, and I mean, eventually it's a blight issue, I think, you know, when you just have them illuminated like that.
But if the business is closed, the light can only, the sign can only stand for 6 months. Then it goes dark.
So the motion is to delete 10-15-3, subsection C, and subsection 3. Are we ready to vote? All those in favor of deleting that? And that is everybody in favor? Okay, Craig, you...
Yeah, this is more of a question than a motion at this point. I'm wondering in the onerous application of the prior code where it became difficult, were the lighting zones part of that issue that made it difficult to apply? Because I noticed in the latest model codes, they still have the zones. They're maybe refined a little bit in description, and I can imagine that, especially when it goes to Board of Adjustment and there's an appeal or a variance request, that variance request may be judged based on a zone that's established for
Well, the
those
lighting
areas.
zone is how they're what lighting zone property's in determines how many lumens they can have on their property. And it's that lighting zone that basically controls that glow issue.
Okay. So that's where the technical aspect comes in, where you really need to calculate the bug and all.
The bugs and the photometrics and all that, yeah.
One question. Regarding the exemption for roadway lighting, is there standards for roadway lighting that they aren't stated in here, but that are location specific?
Yes, there's actually, for right-of-way, I'm sure the Traffic Engineering Department used NHTSA, which I think the National Highway Traffic Standards. So there is, and that's one reason why we excluded typically zoning deals with private property. But there are engineering standards that address street lighting.
But those are addressing traffic, Lynn, traffic safety primarily?
Right.
Right. So that wouldn't get into our issue that's come up repeatedly over the last 12 to 15 months over spillover of roadway lighting into private property.
That's exactly what I was getting at.
Right, I figured it was.
And I've found that also that even in the dark sky model code, street lighting is exempted because there's certain engineering performance requirements for street lighting that are covered by MUTC and AASHTO, which is the American Association of State Highway Engineers or something.
Yeah, I can understand that there are extenuating circumstances for roadway and roadway safety in general, and for that matter, for temporary construction lighting. I'm just not comfortable with the idea of whatever standards we're trying to provide to protect property owners, residents, et cetera, within the city, we're going to make roadway lighting and temporary construction lighting totally exempt from those standards. That makes me very uncomfortable.
And I'm more concerned about permanent roadway lighting than temporary. I mean, obviously, temporary could be a long time, but permanent roadway lighting, if you have a light that doesn't point down in a residential area, that seems unreasonable.
Well, in that case, I'd like to move an amendment or a recommendation that the city reconsider exemptions for roadway lighting and temporary construction lighting.
Second that.
And regarding that, obviously Main Street is one thing. I'm more concerned with residential lighting and the fact that, it not be totally exempted, that the residential lighting be point down, not, wide scale. Even 40 or 90 degrees seems excessive on residential lighting. It should point down.
And that's why I stated it as reconsideration rather than elimination, just to bring it back up and think about it one more time before they commit to something like a blanket exemption.
Craig?
My comment on that is, first of all, under modifications, the temporary construction lighting is administratively considered, so that's already covered.
Yeah, I'd just like to see some standards for it, conditions, under what conditions, not just, okay, you can decide with no measurable standards or criteria. But then that was my major objection to this whole thing, lack of process and lack of definition. Made it very subjective.
And on the roadway lighting, for the reason I just stated, I think that my experience is that towns and cities and municipalities are very responsive to complaints, to neighbors. That there's more control over those than this exemption would suggest. So I'm not sure I could support that motion.
The city, in their installation of the Sternberg lights, though, those are so intrusive. There's so much light coming off of those, and there's no downward glare reflectors on any of that. That goes straight up, it goes out, it goes in 360 degrees around those Sternbergs. Most of the rest of the city has the lights that are, at least they're pointed downwards. The Sternberg, I think, are, that they've made a decision that they want the Sternberg lights, but I think they're put out a lot of light pollution.
I agree. There should probably be a distinction between the roadway lighting and the pedestrian ornamental lighting.
And that's why I'm saying it's somewhere between exempt from all standards and complying with the standards everybody else has to meet. You may have to find a middle ground for things like the sidewalk lighting, street lighting, temporary construction lighting. Even, poor Jan, she's told to cut this down, and I keep adding to it. Even if that means expanding a little bit to establish some objective criteria for those three categories. It's better than saying exempt, let staff figure it out on a case-by-case basis. Provide some kind of guidelines.
So our motion is the city reconsider exemption for roadways and lightings and temporary construction. Did you want to delete temporary construction or just leave it in?
Well, all I'm asking for is them to reconsider it, whether they're giving it a blanket exemption or they're going to establish some minimum guidelines.
Do we want to do a roadway / pedestrian lighting?
Well, most pedestrian lighting is within a roadway being defined as right-of-way in standard parlance. So roadway is going to encompass all that.
The reason why I bring that up is if we're going to be advising city council to make a move on that, I would like to have something that we're mentioning the pedestrian to them also, that's something, because they're just going to see our motion, correct? They're just going to see our motion, and if our motion is roadway lighting, they might not realize that we have the concern of the Sternbergs.
I guess I consider that roadway lighting. And that's all that's listed under exemptions is roadway lighting.
Suzanne?
I was just going to add, they do get the minutes. I don't know how much of the discussion would be in there, but it is included when they won't. Action, okay. Then, yeah, if you want to be specific about that.
Yeah, so it's either way, Steve. Either the sidewalks are included in roadways, in which case if we tell them we'd like them to take that off of the exempt category, we're covered, or roadways don't include sidewalks, in which case it isn't exempt and we're okay, because all the other standards still apply as far as light pollution, that sort of thing.
So you're not agreeing to adding the pedestrian?
Well, it's just hard to say that they ask that they reconsider roadway and pedestrian lighting, since pedestrian lighting isn't listed as an exemption already. That's
Well, if it's considered a roadway lighting, isn't it?
Then it's covered.
Pedestrian lighting is considered roadway lighting? Okay.
What about bike paths?
What was that? I'm sorry.
What about bike paths? So that could potentially,
Well, if the bike path is adjacent to the road, then, I mean.
they would fall under that?
Right.
Not always.
Not always.
If it's on a trail, it would go with recreational,
Okay.
wherever that is.
So Dave moved and Steve seconded. Any other discussion before we vote? Okay, all those in favor? And it is Linda and Craig against. Motion passes. Any other discussion or motions? Okay. All right, are we ready to vote on the main motion? Okay. All those in favor of the main motion? And it is unanimous. Okay, that takes us to public hearings, which there are none. And how about reports? Reports from the staff?
We have nothing.
Pardon?
Nothing.
Okay, and HP board?
I didn't attend, so I don't have anything.
Okay. Anything from the commissioners? Nope. All right, and there is no report from the chair. So can we adjourn to a study session with 9 minutes left?
A motion that we adjourn.
Second.
Motion by Craig and seconded by Kurt. All those in favor? That is unanimous. So now we are in our study session to review the draft downtown area plan.
And we can do this in 9 minutes.
Of course we can.
The good news is that Kelly and Chris Harketh have been working very hard to figure a format for us that we could meet your request. And I think it was a really good one they did too, that what we take to public hearing at Planning Commission and also City Council is as close to the final draft, final format as possible with the images, the photos, the maps included. And they have a format. Kelly has done her first edit, has turned that over to Chris. Chris has started putting that in, the text into the format. Sarah Jane has finished the images, the maps, and has those for Chris. And so our intent is, if nothing happens between now and next week, is to actually get that out to you before the next meeting. So next Wednesday, Thursday for packets. So we would have that draft that we could present to you for your review. So get your okay, so we could then go forward for public hearing. So it's on schedule with the draft that I think you'll be happy with. So.
So the intent of the next meeting would be?
To review, the draft document as presented and as formatted by Chris and Kelly.
And to approve it for movement to the public hearing.
We would then go forward with the public review process, which would include going to Historic Preservation Board, going to staff review, and then also putting it on the website and preparing for a public hearing before Planning Commission. And then, as you recall, Planning Commission will have their public hearing. You'll make a recommendation to City Council. You actually go ahead and adopt or not adopt. You have that authority, and then City Council has a public hearing, at which point they decide to ratify or not ratify, or ratify with suggested modifications. And so they would do that at their second public hearing. So the thought is that the same document that you will see would go forward all the way through City Council public hearing. And no dates for that, just depending on schedule for everything at this point. But
Okay.
So we'd be expecting to see or to talk about that final draft at the August 8th meeting?
Correct.
And make a recommendation?
Correct.
Make a recommendation to submit it for public hearing before we ratify it.
Correct. If you think it's ready to go to public hearing, if you're happy with it, if it says what you want it to say, what you want you to present. So, okay. And the format that Chris and Kelly came up with is one that actually can be modified. We can go ahead and make changes to the text fairly readily. The fear initially was that the format we were originally looking at, you just couldn't make those changes, so the thought was we just need to do the formatting one time. But this one actually, as you make recommendations for change based on the comments you've heard at public hearing, and if those get into the adopted plan or City Council has additional changes, it's pretty easy to modify that.
Okay, any comments on that?
I guess, yeah, I just have a question, Dennis, on the final format when it's issued to the public and accessible. Is it being updated to be more web-friendly, or is it going to be like a PDF document that's linked to the website? Do you know yet how?
I don't know. My thought is, yeah, it's probably more like a PDF, but I don't know if that's true. Yes, that's a good question.
Because there's so many different formats that you can get with
There are,
links.
and I haven't asked that question. It's a good one to ask Chris.
Okay. Anything else? What about our work plan? Sorry, I have to keep bringing it up.
Well, what I've shown the staff is a work plan that I've used in the past, and it's not just for the Planning Commission, but also for historic preservation and even for our Building and Code Division. So my goal is to put it in that format. We have a hearing on our budget with the council in September, and we certainly need to have it done before then. So I would hope to show that to you your first meeting in September. That's my goal.
In the meantime, I'm kind of concerned that we're running out of time with parking and the parameters that City Council kind of put on us to evaluate the parking situation.
Well, let me reassure you that that problem's not going away. So if you're worried about it, that the problem would just solve itself, that won't be the case. But
I was down there this weekend, and it's pretty incredible on a Friday night and how bustling the downtown area is.
I was also there on a Thursday night, and it was pretty busy. So any other issues for discussion?
My only comments are that I'm going to be missing both meetings in August, which means I won't be here for the assumed vote to accept on the 8th. I am therefore requesting officially that my name be stricken from the list as contributors to the comp plan update.
Well, and the first meeting in August is just to move it to public hearing. It's not to,
But we're ratifying a version of what is going to be presented for comment.
okay. So the request is to remove your name from the document. And what about adding some of the names of the planning commissioners that participated, like Julio and Pavlos and...
I think it should be they're in
there,
the current
okay.
draft, I believe. Yeah. So
And are we missing anybody?
if you notice anybody, please let me know, and we'll certainly can add. Yeah, so.
Okay.
You might consider asking those who are not involved in this final version if they want to have their names included.
Good thought. Okay. Good.
I mean, Kent Bagley in particular won't recognize anything in this current version.
So Dave, you're gone the entire month of August? Okay. Anything else?
Although, David, by excluding yourself or even others, and I do understand why you're making that statement, you have contributed to it in significant way. So is there another way to show your contributions, but also state that you are not there present to approve the final ratification?
It's not just because I'm not there to approve it. I don't approve it. No, I don't think so. Not without, I'd rather have a void, just my name not on it, than to make a big fuss about why or a separate statement. I just don't want my name attached to it.
Anything else? Do we have a motion to adjourn about 45 seconds early? Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay.
Second.
All those, seconded by Craig. All those in favor? And it is unanimous, and we are adjourned.